tonight about the forerunner to Jesus Christ. Anybody know who that cool guy is? John the Baptist. And we know a couple weird things about John the Baptist, right? We know that he wore some strange outfits, right? Says he just kind of wore like camel hair and hung out in these very strange outfits. He ate weird things. Anybody know John the Baptist's favorite food? Locusts. Locusts, that's weird. I think, locusts aren't as popular around here, right? But when I lived in the East Coast, locusts were a very big thing and very loud. And so locusts look a lot like, I'm going to say cockroaches. Like, I just can't imagine that being my favorite food every day. But he covered them in wild honey, so maybe it was okay. Not entirely sure. Anyway, this guy was important. He was important because he was the forerunner to Jesus Christ. And so that's why he was important. We don't always talk a lot about him. We always mention him. He's got some big stories in the Bible. But, I think Jesus is so much more important than any person that has ever lived on this earth that, we kind of gloss over that whole beginning part of Jesus' ministry sometimes. And that was John the Baptist, because John the Baptist was, again, the forerunner. You guys say forerunner? Forerunner. It's not just a car. It's also a person. And the forerunner before Jesus Christ is John the Baptist. It's a good thing to know. So throughout the history of our nation, there have always been like wise people that have kind of risen up when there's been a time of crisis. And so maybe you guys have heard of Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry was the one who said, "Give me liberty or give me death." That's right. Abraham Lincoln said, "Conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." That's right. These are smart people. Martin Luther King, right? He dreamt of the day, right, where his children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. So these are smart people who kind of rose up when things were a little bit nutso here in our country. And that's kind of what was going on in Jesus' day. And here comes this smart guy who said a whole bunch of wonderful things, which we'll talk about. But here it is. These guys kind of come in on the horse, and they say these wonderful things, and they encourage us, right? So John the Baptist, he is known for the things that he said too. He says, "After me, comes one, whose sandals I am not worthy to untie." And then John the Baptist also said, "He must increase and I must decrease." And he was talking about Jesus. So we need inspirational people like this. We need people to kind of like whip us into a frenzy sometimes when things are rough, And the men that I spoke about in our history, and then John the Baptist in biblical history, which is, I guess, it's also our history, but you know what I mean. They encourage us. They give us hope, right? Hold on one second. These people who rise up and encourage us, they bring us up, right? And they're intentional. They've got purpose, and they're useful to the Lord, and they're useful to us. So I think we become better people when these people kind of rise up and they give us that encouragement. So I thought I would talk about John the Baptist a little bit, because we're coming up to this tiny, no big deal holiday that's coming up in April. No big deal. Just kidding. It's a huge deal. Easter, right? Easter is the big deal. And that is April 9th. Thank you, Tracy. It's her birthday this year, so I knew she would know it. every couple of years. Her birthday fall, no, not couple. Very, very rarely. Yeah, because Easter moves around a lot. But I thought it's kind of fun to talk about the people who kind of led up to Jesus and all of the goodness that is going to come out of his ministry that we're going to celebrate at Easter. So John the Baptist was born 6 months before Jesus. He was born 6 months before Jesus. He spent less than 2 years doing public ministry. Yet Jesus called him the greatest person ever born of a woman. Jesus said that. He is probably not a lot of people teach on John the Baptist. Again, I think his ministry flows right into Jesus' ministry, and Jesus is so important that a lot of times John the Baptist gets kind of left behind, which is okay with John the Baptist. He's not stressed about that at all. But I thought that it'd be interesting to talk about him tonight. He actually appears in 23 different chapters of Scripture. 23, that's pretty big. And the biblical record in these 23 chapters, it covers 2,000 years that John the Baptist is talked about. Because John the Baptist was foretold. He is a forerunner. He was foretold long before he was ever even born. So he's in the Bible a lot because the story of John the Baptist was told centuries before he ever came on the scene. So of that about 2,000 years that the Bible covers, he was in 750 years of that history. So 6 quick facts about John the Baptist. First one, he was the forerunner of Jesus. You guys already knew that one. Second one, he was a relative of Jesus. So not everybody remembers that his mom Elizabeth was related to Jesus' mother Mary. And it says when the angel Gabriel announced to Mary that she was going to conceive, Gabriel said this in Luke 1:36, your relative Elizabeth, even she has conceived a son in her old age, and this is her 6th month for her who was called childless. Elizabeth never had kids before, and it was way beyond the time that she could even have kids, yet she had them. That was the second fun fact about John the Baptist. The third one is that Jesus said in Luke 7:28, I tell you, among those born of women, no one is greater than John. That's what Jesus said. That's not what I said. That's what Jesus said. He said, of those born of women, no one was greater than John. So I'll just say, Jesus really liked him. Fun fact, he was one of Jesus' favorite. Fun fact number 4, John was a rabbi. John was a rabbi, and this is kind of interesting because this is during a day and time when there weren't a lot of rabbis actually around in this period. The Bible really only talks about, I'm going to say, I think there was maybe about a dozen that the Bible talks about for the 50 years before and after Jesus, people who were called rabbi. There's a very special process to becoming a rabbi. Nowadays, if you're Jewish, you can, just like I went to seminary and I became a pastor, I was called by God, and then I went to school for it, right? And then I was ordained. Rabbis in this day and age are largely the same. They go to a schooling, right? And they get ordained as well, and they become rabbis. In this day and age, it was a little bit different. They didn't get ordained, they got shmika. And so shmika is actually when God talks to you. And so it's a different kind of authority. And 2 rabbis who have been talked to by God, they have to come in agreement, and they have to lay hands on this person and ordain him as a rabbi. It was a little bit more complicated, I'll just say that. So there weren't a lot in the Bible at this time, but John the Baptist was. John the Baptist was, and we know that he had shmika, and we know that that's a good Hebrew word. And so we know this because in John 3:25, it says, "Then a dispute arose between John's disciples and a Jew about purification." John had disciples. The Bible says that. John had disciples. Teachers don't have disciples. Rabbis have disciples. And then we know that Jesus would have disciples, right? Because in the beginning, that's what they were calling Jesus. They were calling him Rabbi. And so the fifth fun fact about John the Baptist is that he came to prepare the people. His ministry was preparing people to receive Jesus. I say that because in John 1:7 it says, "He came as a witness to testify about the light so that all might believe through him." And then in John 1:31, John says, "I came baptizing with water so that he might be revealed to Israel." It said, and then in John 3:30, he says, I must increase, I must decrease, and he must increase. His whole idea, his whole ministry was to prepare the way for Jesus. And he was very intent on that. It was never about him. So that's the kind of the lead in to the sixth fact about John the Baptist, is that that's what he was doing. His ministry was going to look a lot like Jesus' ministry, especially in the very beginning. John's birth, John was born right before Jesus, right? And it says that his birth actually encouraged Mary, actually encouraged her. And then John's baptism of Jesus actually was kind of the official beginning of Jesus' ministry. John's ministry was even kind of like an early model for Jesus' ministry. Now, Jesus didn't need a model, obviously. He came to do something that nobody had ever done. But John was kind of already doing things, and Jesus kind of was able to step in. Everybody was recognizing what John the Baptist was doing, and Jesus said, yeah, I'm going to just kind of continue that. It was even in Mark 1:15 and 16, John's imprisonment. Once John became imprisoned, that's when Jesus started to pick his own disciples. So I don't know if you can see, but John the Baptist's ministry and Jesus' ministry are very interwoven. There was a lot going on that the two of them were kind of cycling around each other. And then in Matthew 14, when John the Baptist was killed, anybody know how he was actually killed? Gruesome, beheaded. He was beheaded. And so literally they brought his head on a platter to show. Anyway, that's another story. Not a great day. But John's death prompted Jesus to retreat. And then Matthew 14, we know that there was something, well, we call it the miracle of Moses, because that's when Jesus fed the 5,000. Moses also fed a lot of people with the whole manna thing. So we kind of call that a miracle of Moses. John appears in 23 chapters of Scripture for over 750 years of the time that the Bible covers, as I've told you before. So John's story, and the very first message about John the Baptist, was 700 years before his birth. 700 years. And it was all about comfort and encouragement, that early message about John would be coming. And I don't know about you, but I could use some comfort and some encouragement today. And it's pretty great that God had, I think I'm a good planner, but God is a really good planner. He was planning for this guy long before he was ever born. In fact, he told Isaiah about him, and Isaiah wrote in the Scriptures about John the Baptist. So let me tell you about Isaiah and about Isaiah chapter 39. So if you have your Bibles today, pull up Isaiah 39. We're gonna start there. But I think to fully kind of appreciate this, it's nice to know a little bit what was going on 700 years, 750-ish years before Jesus was ever born. So I don't know if you guys know, but there was a period of time where Israel was actually two different countries. And one was called Israel, right? But the kingdom in the south, so the top of what we know now is as Israel was called Israel, but the south was called Judah. Have you ever heard of that, Lion of Judah? Yeah. So at this time in Israel's history, in God's people's history, Israel was actually two different countries. So this was important. So at that time, the nation, what we know as, actually it's more like Iran. That was called Assyria at this point. It was strong and aggressive, and they were on the march. And they were conquering, and they were gobbling up every single country around them. And it was a frightening time. It was a frightening time for those people because they knew that they were next, right? You think of World War II, you think of all these different things where countries are just sitting there. They can't do too much about this great dictator who is coming in and is going to gobble them up. So God does what he always does when his people are in peril. He sends them a prophet. And that's what he was doing here in the Old Testament for Isaiah. He sends him Isaiah to speak to the kingdom of the south. That's Judah again. And for 36 chapters, Isaiah warns them that Assyria is coming. Assyria is coming. That's not good. When God's prophet is like, hey, guess what? I'm here to comfort you, but I'm also here to tell you Assyria is coming, and y'all are going to be judged for your sins. Judah wasn't really following the Lord at this time, and they said, you best be scared because Assyria is coming. But then in chapter 37 of Isaiah, Judah's king Hezekiah seeks Isaiah's counsel, and he prays, and he asks God to forgive the people and prolong the days of their land. And God does. He says, you know what? Because you asked, I will postpone my judgment on Judah, and the punishment will not come through the Assyrians. Imagine that, though. He said, you will be judged. You will be punished, but it won't come through the hands of the Assyrians. He said, it will be coming from the Babylonians, years in the future. So Assyria is modern-day Iran. Babylonia is modern-day Iraq. So things haven't changed very much in 2,700 years. It's still a crazy place to live. Isaiah 39 ends with the prophecy that Judah is going to be overrun one day by the nation of Babylon. And in verse 5 it says, then Isaiah said to King Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord of armies. Look, the days are coming when everything in your palace and all that your fathers have stored up until today will be carried off to Babylon, and nothing will be left. Some of your descendants who come from you, whom you father, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. That's Isaiah 39, 5 through 7. Isaiah spoke these words in 703 BC. So imagine how you'd feel when Isaiah, the prophet of the land, just said, your kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids are going to be carried off. And that's bad news. I'll just say, that's bad news. The people were devastated, and the people were in mourning, because nobody wants to be overrun. They didn't want to be overrun by the Assyrians, but they definitely didn't want to know that years from now, the Babylonians would take their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren. God heard their mourning. God heard their sadness, and he responded, as God always does. So Isaiah 39 is It's a hard chapter. But if you turn over to Isaiah 40, there's better news. In Isaiah 40, it says, "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and announce to her that her time of forced labor is over. Her iniquity has been pardoned, and she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins." So this is the passage starting in verse 3, Isaiah 40, that introduces the coming of this forerunner of Jesus Christ. It says, "A voice of one crying out, 'Prepare the way of the Lord in the wilderness, make a straight highway for our God in the desert. Every valley will be lifted up, and every mountain and hill will be leveled. Uneven ground will become smooth, and the rough places a plain.'" So you might be saying to yourself, how do I know that that's about John the Baptist? Because it doesn't say his name there. But in the New Testament, in Matthew 3, Mark 1, Luke 3, and John 1, they all quote that exact verse, Isaiah 40, verse 3. And they attribute the voice, the one who cries out in the wilderness, to John the Baptist. So the good news is that the message that God gives, that God gave those discouraged people in 700 BC, he gives encouragement. He gave encouragement to them, but he's still giving us encouragement today. It says in verse 5, "And the glory of the Lord will appear, and all humanity together will see it, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." One day, he says, this forerunner will come and will declare the glory of the Lord, who is going to appear and come in human form. And we know that he did. That was Jesus Christ. Here's a little perspective, though. You know, he's saying in verse 7, he says, the grass withers, the flower fades, the breath of the Lord blows on them. Indeed, the people are grass. He's saying, you know, we're not very big, and we don't last for very long, do we? But God is big, and his words and his promises last forever and ever and ever. And it goes on down, and he talks about, even in verse 11, I'm still in Isaiah 40, he protects his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms, and he carries them in the fold of his garment. He gently leads those who are nursing. So this is how God was preparing the world for his son. And this is the message of the forerunner, of John the Baptist. And so if you are discouraged, right, if you are afraid, if you're worried about what's happening, I don't know, if you watch the news and you kind of look around and you go, I don't see anything good. The forerunner, John the Baptist, he said a few things, and they are still for us today. When we are discouraged, God is never silent. God is never silent. It said in verse 40, in Isaiah 40, verse 2, it said, God says, "Speak tenderly to Jerusalem." I love this, because when we're discouraged, God speaks tenderly, right? Even in, I love this. This is my favorite. In Isaiah 42, verses 2 and 3. Isaiah 42, verses 2 and 3. "He will not cry out or shout, or make his voice heard in the streets. He will not break a bruised reed. He will not put out a smoldering wick. He will faithfully bring justice." How softly do you have to walk to not break a bruised reed? Or how softly do you have to speak to avoid blowing out a smoldering wick? That's pretty amazing. When the prophet Elijah was discovered because Jezebel was seeking his life, the Bible said that God spoke to him in a gentle whisper. Elijah was scared for his life, but God stopped and spoke to him in a gentle whisper. When the Israelites, we talked about, and they're discovered, when they were discouraged because they knew that the Babylonians would someday carry off their kids and their grandkids and their great grandkids, they were nervous. But God sent Isaiah to them to tell them wonderful news, wonderful news. And when the Israelites were discouraged because they were oppressed by the Romans, this was all the way in John the Baptist's day, and in Jesus' day, they were oppressed by the Romans. God sent John the Baptist to speak to them about what God was going to do. God is never silent. He's never silent. God is speaking to you, and he is speaking to me. Sometimes we don't hear him. That's usually because the TV is on, right? Or because you're on Facebook or you're on Instagram, or you're playing your music so loud, maybe, that it drowns out the voice of God. There's something to say of, there's something to be said about sitting in quiet. And I know that we don't do that a lot today. I don't do that a lot today. My life is not very quiet as it seems. But, in the silence of God, when you are silent, you can really hear him speak because he is not silent. The next thing the Forerunner told us, and we still is today, is that God always has a plan for his people. He does. He's the best planner. He's got a plan. Verse 3 in Isaiah 40, a voice of one crying out, prepare the way of the Lord in the wilderness. Make straight highway for our God in the desert. Make a straight highway for our God in the desert. Every valley will be lifted up, and every mountain and hill will be leveled, and uneven ground will become smooth. And the rough places a plain. When a king is coming, and a king is going to come out of his castle, they roll out the red carpet, and he doesn't have to, walk on the dirt or whatever. But the Forerunner is announcing the coming of the King of Kings. Like, he's the coming of the King of Kings. So when the Forerunner comes, well, forget the carpet. He said, I'm going to pave a highway for the King of Kings. And I'm going to fill in the low spots, and I'm going to knock down the high spots so that when he comes, he can just come on smooth ground. When Martin Luther King wanted to encourage himself, he preached, every valley will be lifted up, and every mountain and hill will be leveled. It reminded him that God is going to make everything right someday. He's going to do that. So the Forerunner is saying God has a plan, and he's going to smooth it out. I know it feels hilly, and there's some big, deep valleys right now, but God's going to smooth it out. The third thing the Forerunner says is that God always has words of hope for his people, always. Isaiah 40, verse 5 said, and the glory of the Lord will appear, and all humanity together will see it, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. The fourth thing that the Forerunner is telling them and is telling us today, that God plans so carefully, so well. God plans so well that not only did he plan for Jesus, he planned for Jesus' Forerunner. That's a good plan. That is a good plan. There's in Isaiah 49 through 11 or so, he's talking about, Isaiah's talking about the Messiah. And John kind of repeats these words even in his day. And he says, you may be scared. You may feel small. Your circumstances may surely be overwhelming. But the Messiah is coming, and you cannot even fathom his strength. So when trials are coming, you can have hope. To discourage people, especially to those discouraged people in Isaiah's day, they're nervous. They're nervous that the Babylonians are going to come someday. And then in John the Baptist and Jesus' day, they were nervous about the Romans and all that they were doing to the Christians in that day. I don't know if you've looked around in our day, but we have all of these people who seem to be breathing down our country's neck. China, what are they doing? Russia, why won't they leave Ukraine alone? They definitely, I think they'd stomp over us in a heartbeat if they could. So it's really easy to get discouraged. It's really easy to get overwhelmed. And if you're not overwhelmed by that, then maybe you're overwhelmed by illness or addictions or debt or loneliness or discouragement in any form. Let me read this to you again. Isaiah 40, verse 11. He protects his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms, and he carries them in the fold of his garment. He gently leads those that are nursing. So if you are a child of God today, if you're a child of God, if you are part of his flock, the word is telling you, don't be afraid. Don't fear. God is going to protect you. I know sometimes he seems a little distant, maybe a little quiet. But he says, I protect my sheep. That's what I do. And even in this moment, he is wrapping his arms around you because he wants to carry you right next to his heart. I even love that last phrase that he said, he gently leads those that are nursing. God says to us through John the Baptist, right? I'm leading you. I'm gently leading you. You are in my arms. I love that. The last thing about the Forerunner tonight is probably important, and that's just a great thing to wrap up and say, the Forerunner, John the Baptist, he was incredible. But you know who he wasn't? He wasn't Jesus. He wasn't the Messiah. He was a man. He was a human. He was not, he was not all God as Jesus was. But God used his voice. God used his words. God used him to encourage people. And God can use you and your words and your voice to encourage others. If you're discouraged, God will speak tenderly to you. That's what the word says. It says, a bruised reed he will not break. That's how gently he moves. He says, a smoldering wick he will not put out. That's how softly he speaks. But God will also provide human voices and hearts and hands and prayers to help you when you need it. God uses people to encourage discouraged people. So I hope this week that you will even be that tender voice to somebody who needs encouragement, right? And after being introduced here to the forerunner of Jesus Christ, John the Baptist, Jesus said in Matthew 11, 28, 29, and 30, Jesus said, come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Jesus said, take up my yoke and learn from me, because I am lowly and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. He wants to encourage each of us today. And I think in this day, in these times, it seems so appropriate. I feel like I've never needed more encouragement than I do today. And Jesus says, I'm right there.